Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to the last episode in our Season 2 finale series in which we're recapping major genre groups across the entirety of the 1990s. This is the punk episode, so we finally hit the end here. Just as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any of the other episodes in this recap series, you can feel free to check them out. They hit just about every major genre group that you can think of across the entirety of the decade that was meaningful. As well, if you're interested in going back and listening to the actual 1990s season, which was shockingly shorter than this entire recap series, go check those out too, because it's all waiting for you to go year by year across the 90s in my essential albums for those years and why. Also, as a reminder, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I discussed in today's episode, I've put the link for this playlist in the episode description here. As well, if you're interested in listening to my big list for all of the 1990s in which I've pulled together just about every meaningful song I can think of or find for the decade, now that I'm dropping this episode here, I will have also dropped the 1990s recap. So if you're listening to this far flung in the future, I dropped this a long time ago, so make sure you go check out my 90s recap big giant list. There's a lot of songs in there. It started off from like 20,000 songs down to 3,200 songs down to the actual list that I give you. So it took a lot of work to get there, so go enjoy it. So what are we going to be talking about today? As always, for this entire recap series, we're going to be reviewing what we recapped in the 1980s for punk music. Next, we're going to overview the two subgenres that we're going to be discussing today. And then finally, we're going to dive into each of those subgenres with milestone songs across the decade and why we chose them. So, in the 1980s recap, we only put forward 3 songs to create the trajectory of punk music for the decade. We started with The Replacements' I Hate Music, which was a great song, Social Distortion's Moral Threat, amazing song, and Billy by Bad Religion. 3 fantastic songs and 3 very good articulations of where we start, what's in the middle, and how we end punk music in the 1980s. And this is to say, too, that we're not even really talking about post-punk, because if we were, then it would be a totally separate conversation, but we didn't. So these were the 3 major that we talked about here. But like in the 1980s, let's not forget about amazing artists such as Dead Kennedys, for example, because they were fantastic too. We just didn't talk about them in the 80s recap, but just understand that post-punk was also very much alive and well in the 1980s. And so as a lead-in from Bad Religion's Billy, we can talk about the 2 major subgenres that evolved aggressively over the course of the 1990s in punk music. One was what I call neo-punk, and the other is pop-punk. So really, it's just the more traditional punk angle, but it's a newer version of it for the 1990s, or pop-punk music in its current iteration in the 1990s, because I think we talked a little bit here and there about the ideas of pop punk with, for example, the very, very beginnings of Madonna or Cyndi Lauper to a certain extent, except she was a little bit more ska. That was her bent of counterculture. Or the Go-Go's, for example, that was pop punk like way back in the 1980s before pop punk was even really a thing in its current iteration. I think you could probably justify that the Clash was pop punk to a certain extent. But when we talk about pop punk in this context, it's just the 90s version of it. So to start off with, let's get into neo-punk. So like I said, neo-punk is basically just the traditional bent of punk music that continued on into the 90s when pop punk was becoming even more of its own thing and becoming even more fully realized in the 90s. There had to be that more traditional counterculture punk movement that wasn't necessarily like hardcore punk, because obviously there was also slowcore, sadcore, and shoegaze that was happening at the time that probably sliced off a huge chunk of hardcore people and went in that direction. And then alternative rock had probably gobbled up a bunch of punk people. So did grunge. Probably a bit of metal had gobbled up some punk people. So the traditional punk movement in the 90s probably just became more truncated down to its essential bits and became much more of its own thing and less generalizable across major genre groups like it did more so in the 1980s. So it became just more specifically its own community and less general. I think also that pop punk probably accumulated a lot of those more general notes of punk music and really commandeered the conversation for most of the 90s. So traditional punk didn't so much go underground as it just became very niche, let's just say. So for this neo-punk movement, we're actually going to start with a proto example, which happened in 1990. And the reason that we say it's a proto version, even though punk has been around for ages and ages at this point, is it's just a proto version of what the 90s iteration of traditional punk would be. And it's Social Distortion by Social Distortion, and the track is So Far Away. Obviously, Social Distortion was in our 1980s recap with Moral Threat being an absolute magnum opus of a punk track because it's just long and it's fantastic and it's got a lot going on there. So Far Away, I think, in a way, is probably trying to pull some of the greatness that Moral Threat gave us several years prior and trying to update it for more current conventions in the 1990s. That's my story. I'm not totally sure how committed Social Distortion was to Moral Threat for a meaningful amount of time, but it hits me really hard, and it is very distinctive as a punk perspective, so I may be reading into it. But So Far Away is very Social Distortion. It's got that early British punk vibe to it, but it's also got some hard rock behind it. Honestly, it's very Moral Threat. It's got that vibe to it. It's a really good baseline for us where Social Distortion was certainly playing with pop punk ideas and softening punk up all throughout the 80s, them and Bad Religion both. But So Far Away just sounds like they're not necessarily focused so much on softening it up or going post-punk, but that they're more focused on just creating high quality traditional punk music for this new decade. So that's why we start with So Far Away. So next we move laterally also into 1990, still in 1990, with the first wave. So Bad Religion in this case leapt out and actually did better declare a traditional punk movement for the 1990s, same year, with their album Against the Grain, and the track is 21st Century and then Digital Boy in parentheses. So 21st Century Digital Boy. This is just a little bit more confident. It's a little bit more fully realized. It makes sense, right? Because Social Distortion we called out as being kind of in the middle of the journey of 1980s punk with Moral Threat, and Bad Religion in 1988-89 had already fully realized what this new punk movement was going to be. And to be fair, Billy is much more pop punk than it is traditional punk, but the thing about Bad Religion is that they often hopped back and forth between being traditional punk and pop punk in their albums to probably just create a much more widely acceptable product for a bigger audience. So in this case, they're bringing forward a much better declared traditional punk perspective for the 1990s with 21st Century Digital Boy. And you could tell the difference between So Far Away and 21st Century Digital Boy, that So Far Away sounds more 80s-ish. 21st Century Digital Boy still a little bit sounds like Billy, but it also sounds like it's moving in harder rock directions and is a little bit more experimentational than So Far Away was. Like that hard rock that was getting played with in the mid 80s that was getting combined with punk, it's not so much there, and it's a little bit more just focusing on the pure straight ahead punk. But juxtapose this to the punk in the early 80s, juxtapose this to post-punk a la Dead Kennedys or even the punk in the 70s and 60s, like this does sound way, 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 way softer. This sounds much softer, and it sounds a little bit more dynamic. It sounds a little less angry, and it sounds like it's just riding the punk wave, but it's not necessarily taking it in those hard counterculture directions. Because let's be honest, in 1990, there was a really crowded field in the realm of rock and counterculture rock music. Punk was just one voice of many. And so the real question was, how can traditional punk distinguish itself now between all these things that grunge is gobbling up, what's going on in the pop punk space, what's going on with alternative rock at that moment, because Pixies had been pulling in all sorts of punk artifacts for years already, as well as Sonic Youth. Slowcore, sadcore, shoegaze was just coming into its own and figuring itself out. So like, where was punk to go? And Bad Religion was one of those few artists that was really trying to continue to establish itself and establish the traditional punk brand for the 90s going forward. And it was hard. It was a very crowded field, and they struggled mightily, and they did manage to firmly establish themselves as something distinctive that wasn't pop punk either, because pop punk was also happening in 1990 and it didn't really sound like this. So then in 1994, so 4 years later, we move into the second wave of neo punk, and it's by The Offspring on their album Smash, and the track is Come Out and Play. This is a really interesting track because it's basically saying, if this is the second wave of traditional punk music, because this is definitely not pop punk either, that punk is becoming kind of playful and self-effacing in its counterculturedom. It's taking the silliness and the not taking itself seriously about punk from at least the 80s, but it probably harkens back even further, and makes it more so what the traditional punk of the 1990s is that it's kind of silly, but it also kind of rocks hard. And it has a perspective, but it doesn't take itself that seriously. And again, it doesn't have the distinct pop hooks that pop punk has, because again, pop punk is its own distinctive thing that we're going to talk about here in a couple minutes. But Come Out and Play, while entertaining and kind of silly in how it's played, and it has a little bit of a Clash vibe to it, it's traditional. It's more traditional punk music. And obviously The Offspring is known at this point in their run, early in their run, before they get to Pretty Fly for a White Guy, to be a much more straight ahead traditional punk band. They're not hardcore punk, but they're definitely that middle of the road traditional punk. And this track is basically signaling that out perfectly, that it's creating that community around punk. It's creating a community that reinforces that it's not taking itself super seriously, but it does have a perspective to it. It's a little bit silly, it's a little bit fun, but it's also kind of hard. So because of that, it's creating this juxtaposition where by 1994, grunge was taking itself really way too seriously. Slowcore, sadcore, shoegaze, super serious. Indie rock, super serious. Alternative rock and the third wave, super serious. This is not serious, right? So it's different. It's carving out that little space in the counterculture community for itself and making people who are new listeners or existing listeners feel okay about coming to the table and enjoying it together. So it's very interesting. And then by 1998, we get to the third wave of neo-punk for the decade, this traditional punk idea. And it's by Refused on their album, The Shape of Punk to Come, very prophetic. And the track is Liberation Frequency. This basically takes Come Out and Play and turns it up about 3 notches. It's certainly got silly elements to it. The album cover itself kind of elicits this very silly, kitschy vibe, but then you actually get into the hard punk side of it, and it's really, really punk. It's hard rocking, and it's got a really intense perspective to it, but it's, again, super playful in the parts where it's not intense. So it's that push and pull, the soft and hard, the sharp and the dull, all put together, creating this really dynamic package that is distinctly traditional punk for the 1990s, or as I call it, neo-punk. So isn't that fun? Listening to So Far Away, which sounded like it was taking itself a little bit more seriously than it needed to, but it was just softened. 21st Century was desperately trying to figure out where punk could possibly land in this new decade. Come Out and Play had kind of figured it out, and then Liberation Frequency apparently was the shape of punk to come. And as a result, it makes me really excited to follow punk over the course of the 2000s, because I don't really remember it at all, let alone the punk of the 2010s or 2020s, because I'm sure it continues to exist in some form or fashion, and I'm excited if Liberation Frequency was the shape of punk to come. I'm super excited to see where it goes next. So it's a really fun little jaunt through the neo-punk journey of the 1990s, but it's got some really fun, impactful stuff. So if you really like this stuff, I'd definitely check out the rest of The Shape of Punk to Come, because it is a really fun album. Refused is super great. They really kind of hit you with that 1-2 punch of everything's cool and great, and then they smack you in the face with the punk. It's really good stuff. So go enjoy it. So now let's move into pop punk, which was a very, 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 very dense subgenre in the 1990s. I would say that most people who were alive in the 1990s were absolutely suffocated in pop punk music almost every day, especially after Dookie by Green Day came out. They were just suffocated in pop punk music. So because of that, let's go enjoy it together. And interestingly enough, we are going to start in 1990 with Green Day, with a proto pop punk example for the 1990s, because like I said, the Go-Go's had already happened in the early 80s, and like pop punk was already kind of swirling, but this 90s iteration of pop punk, totally different. So the very early markers and beginnings of what pop punk would be starts for us in 1990 with this proto example by Green Day on their album 1039/Smoothed Out Slappy Hours, and the track is At the Library. So first of all, this sounds like Burnout by Green Day on Dookie, first and foremost. Like, I don't think anybody's going to deny that. You hear the riff on At the Library, you hear how Billie Joe Armstrong is singing, it basically just sounds like Burnout. So it was like a study of an eventual painting to be. So it's a really fun way for you to baseline yourself on where did we start the decade when it comes to pop punk, and it's pretty apropos that we would start with Green Day, so there it is. The difference you can hear in this track compared to So Far Away, At the Library sounds much more irreverent. It sounds more indignant. It sounds like it's much younger, like it's for a younger audience, a younger crowd. And no surprise, because at the time, I'm sure the entirety of Green Day on average was 17, 18 years old, maybe something like that. They were probably just out of high school not too long ago. So because of that, they're just bringing that youthful energy to punk and ushering in this new era of late stage Gen Xers and early stage millennials into into the fold when it comes to pop punk music. So they're delivering that youth here. So next we move then into 1993, so 3 years later, with the actual established first wave of pop punk with The Muffs by The Muffs, and their track is Saying Goodbye. It sounds like an evolution off of At the Library, not to say that The Muffs were taking anything from Green Day at the time, but in case they weren't, it's clear that there was a huge community of pop punk artists and bands that were all coalescing around the same ideas around the same time in the early 1990s, coming up with these really irreverent, young-sounding tracks that were trying to tap into youth culture at the time and talking about how banal and how annoying everyday life is and how we can rebel against just the little things in life. And it doesn't always have to be about undercutting and destroying the establishment. It could just be complaining about how daily life is really lame and boring and our friends are stupid and going to the mall is lame and I want to be a little bit more cultured than my friends. So it's like counterculture, but it's counterculture light. You step your little pinky toe into counterculture. You're not all the way in there, but you could still kind of claim that you're cooler than your friends because they're all listening to straight ahead pop music for 1993. It's just a little pinky toe in counterculture. It's not anything serious. No strong commitment there. But then by 1994, so just a year later, we do get to Green Day's Dookie and we get to the second wave with Welcome to Paradise. So Saying Goodbye was probably the late stage of the first wave, though I will say that Welcome to Paradise specifically is a call out second wave track on an otherwise predominantly first wave album. So Welcome to Paradise, the guitars just rock a little bit harder. There's got a length to the song. There's a whole story behind it. I think that the irreverence is even more palpable in Welcome to Paradise as it's telling the story than probably some of the other tracks where they're more just idle complaining. I think this takes the irreverence into a much more relatable place for most young people than your average traditional punk music of the 90s at the time. So if you compare this up to Come Out and Play by Offspring, which happened in the same year, they definitely don't sound similar to each other. Come Out and Play sounds much more like a playful traditional punk counterculture idea that has almost no pop hooks to it by comparison. Welcome to Paradise is basically a pop song that has punk elements to it. And also Green Day's thing is infusing old school rock and roll into their music like the Beatles. So because of that, it's their own vibe, but it's definitely creating a wider acceptability across a much, much, much bigger audience. Like there's a huge contingent of the population of listeners that will relate to Welcome to Paradise, more so than probably any of the pop punk that's come out beforehand. So because of that, second wave. So then we move 3 years into the future to our third wave of pop punk. So I didn't actually know we get to the third wave, let alone a fourth wave, but we will. On the album Set You Free by Chisel, and the track is On Warmer Music. So the interesting thing about Chisel is that they supposedly were floating around in the punk scene and the pop punk scene and the indie pop scene or what have you, theoretically playing with these ideas of completely subverting the punk genre in favor of taking it over and doing more different, interesting things with the genre as a whole. And so On Warmer Music in 1997, being third wave as it is, was that carry forward from Welcome to Paradise, where Welcome to Paradise, certainly leaving aside the rock and roll elements, because that is Green Day's thing, stripping that out and looking at what the rest of it is that irreverence, that generalizability. On Warmer Music, first of all, it's talking about how we've been going hard on this hardcore music, this punk music for a really long time, and we want to move on to warmer music. And this warmer music is that pop punk idea where certainly this sounds like what eventually will become the later stages of pop punk, like your Blink-182s or the multitude of artists that come after them, because there are many of them. It feels like a bridge onto that next iteration of what pop punk is going to be. It's got those hard driving guitars a little bit like Welcome to Paradise does, but it's a lot more subtle, and it's even more irreverent. I would say that the irreverence is going up and up. At the Library was a tiny bit irreverent, Saying Goodbye a little bit, Welcome to Paradise much more so, On Warmer Music even more so. So the irreverence is going up, even if the population of people that would accept this and be interested in this music is widening and expanding ever increasingly because pop punk is hitting a wider and wider audience. The irreverence is absolutely going up. So it's in a way becoming even more punk, which is funny to say. But then we move 2 years later to 1999, so the official of 1999, to the early part of the fourth wave with My Own Worst Enemy by Lit on their album A Place in the Sun. And we didn't talk about Lit. We didn't talk about A Place in the Sun because it didn't really bubble up. But My Own Worst Enemy is a very, very popular pop punk song from 1999. It sounds a little bit more dynamic than Welcome to Paradise. Welcome to Paradise just kind of sounds like a hard rocking song. My Own Worst Enemy sounds like an evolution off of On Warmer Music, where it's not just a straight ahead pop song like Welcome to Paradise was. It's got a little bit more of a counterculture vibe to it. It's not nearly as straight ahead. It comes at you from an angle like On Warmer Music does, but it's got more of those hard rocking guitars like Welcome to Paradise did. So it took both of those pieces of the second wave of Welcome to Paradise and On Warmer Music's third wave of being a little bit more subverted and put them together where it's subverted and it's irreverent and it's definitely complainy, like there's a lot to complain about in this song, but it still rocks like Welcome to Paradise did. It just rocks in its own way. So because of that, it's this sort of early fourth wave where it's bridging out of the third, taking a little bit of the second, and becoming an even wider audience hit than Dookie by Green Day, where this just sounds like even more evolved. It actually makes Welcome to Paradise sound pretty archaic by comparison. It was 5 years prior, but it sounds much more archaic by comparison. And then finally, we end at the very end of the fourth wave, I presume, at the end of 1999 with Blink-182's Enema of the State, and the track is All the Small Things, which we didn't talk about. We've talked about Blink-182 over the course of season 2, but we didn't talk about Enema of the State, shockingly, and All the Small Things, which is a wildly famous hit for them, obviously. So All the Small Things basically just takes what second wave was doing, third wave, and the beginning of fourth wave, and just mushes it all together into one highly consumable package. All the Small Things is a absolute pinnacle of pop punk genius for the 1990s. It just takes all of the things that were getting played with over the course of the decade and shoves it into one song. It's got the hard rock of Welcome to Paradise. It's got the jilted guitar work of My Own Worst Enemy. It's got the irreverence of On Warmer Music. It's even got some of that early micro irreverence from Saying Goodbye and At the Library. Like, it just pulls everything together. Blink-182 just made this quintessential 90s pop punk song with All the Small Things. And it was everywhere. It was everywhere on the radio, and probably made them even more wildly famous than they'd ever been before. Rightly so, because it's a fantastic track and it just perfectly typifies pop punk music for the decade. So there it is. And then if you go back and listen to All the Small Things and At the Library, night and day, totally different. In different universes, in different multiverses. They're different. So because of that, enjoy the journey. So, having said that, what'd you agree with? What'd you disagree with? Did you agree that there was this split out between this neo-traditional punk of the 1990s and pop punk of the 1990s, and they were distinct movements and they were separate from each other and they were growing at the same time in their own ways? Maybe. Did you disagree with what I said about how all the other subgenres of rock and counterculture had sliced off huge chunks of the punk community, and as a result, it created this much more like inculcated punk contingent that were just focused on this one thing and weren't really paying attention to stuff elsewhere? Maybe. I'd like to believe that counterculture is almost always a broader community itself because they're all kind of rebelling against culture. But the 1990s was a really interesting moment where there was a lot of contention, and as I said in the Underground Rock finale series episode, that the purity tests that were happening between groups of counterculture was certainly something that was bubbling up from the 80s, from the 70s, and I would like to believe kind of exploded in the 90s where it hit a fevered pitch of purity tests. And so is it possible that people in the punk space that remained in the punk space and dug their heels in didn't regard those other counterculture movements in the rock space? Maybe. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they did. I don't really know. I didn't do the research. So maybe I was right about that. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe you agree. Maybe you disagree. What'd I miss? We didn't talk about Riot Girl very much. It's because it didn't really evolve. I'd like to believe we talked about Riot Girl at length during the episodes in which we did talk about Slater-Kinney. So Slater-Kinney wasn't the only example of Riot Girl. There's plenty more. I think I probably threw even more in my big list for the 1990s, so you should probably go look for that. But didn't miss it, just didn't evolve too much during the 90s. Was great and important, though. Not going to deny that. What'd you learn? Did you learn about the trajectory of pop punk music over the course of the 90s? Hopefully, there was a lot of it. There was a ton of it. Did you learn more about the neopunk movement over the 1990s? It was kind of interesting, wasn't it? This tiny little offshoot subgenre that was really just trying to keep its head above water, figuring itself out, trying to retain its relevance and find its own voice in this very, very crowded counterculture space. Did you learn about that? It's pretty fun, isn't it? It's pretty interesting. So like I said before, if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I discussed in today's episode, please check out the playlist that I've linked in the description of the episode here. As well, go check out my big list for the 1990s. It's dropped, so go check it out. There's a lot of music in there. Enjoy it at your convenience. It's great, and I put a lot of work into it, so go revel in the greatness that was 90s music excellence. Please make sure that you join us again, because eventually we'll get to season 3, in which we'll be talking about the 2000s, so check us out. Make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us so that other people can find us more easily. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. Make sure that you subscribe so that when we do drop season 3, that you're right there with us so you don't miss it. Make sure that you tell everybody that you know and don't know. Tell everybody that loves punk that you know, or people that hate punk that you know, or people that you think probably should get into punk because they could use some counterculture in their life. Tell everybody. Because the thing is that pop punk certainly took over the airwaves in the 1990s, no doubt. Nobody's going to argue that. But the neo-punk movement flew a little bit more under the radar. I think that there's a lot more that people could learn about that or benefit from this beginning of a conversation with this high-level overview about what happened across the decade, and there's plenty more to dig in here on, I guarantee you. So tell everybody about it, because it's a really great conversation to have about this nuanced piece of the counterculture movement of the 90s that might have been overlooked in favor of much louder voices, but in many respects ushered in probably all of those huge voices in the late 80s that eventually overtook the punk voice in one way or another, interestingly enough. So tell everybody, have that conversation, shout about it, listen to The Shape of Punk to Come, Liberation Frequency by Refused, and just scream about it, because that's what punk is all about. And to that end also, I mean, let's not ever forget to tell ourselves that as we're listening to any of this punk music, even if it's pop punk and it's just kind of gently irreverent and you're putting your tiny little pinky toe in counterculture and it's not super serious, that it's still not that scary. It's just punk music. Thanks for listening, everybody.